Hi, I'm Kelly Chase and this is History Detective, and today I want to talk about the one and the only Joan of Arc. It's not often that you can say this about a teenage peasant girl from almost 600 years ago, but there are hundreds of books and thousands of scholarly articles written about her. Plus, there have been countless movies and songs about her. That's pretty impressive for a teenage peasant from the 1400s who died before her 20th birthday. Joan of Arc was born in 1412, but before we meet her, it's important to set a little bit of context for what was going on in the world. 75 years before she was born, there was a serious conflict that was going on between France and England. So serious that they now call it the 100 Years' War, even though it actually went for about 116 years. As you can imagine, a war that went for more than a century was very complicated. But to put it in a nutshell, the French and the English were fighting about who had the right to legitimately rule over France. The English had been ruling over France from a distance, and the French did not accept their right to rule. There were some periods of peace, but this war had been going on for a very long time by the time that Joan of Arc came into the picture. By the time Joan was a teenager, the 100 Years' War conflict had heated up again, and there were people that believed that a French royal called Charles VII should be the legitimate ruler. Joan of Arc was one of these people. Joan was a peasant born in a village called Domremy, and this village was located on the frontier near where one of the big battles of the 100 Years' War was occurring. Her life was directly impacted by this fight for Charles VII to be the rightful King of France. Joan was a devout Catholic, and when she was 13 years old, she experienced some visions, heard voices, and believed that she had been visited by Saint Margaret, Saint Catherine, and Saint Michael. These saints told her that it was her mission to help free France from English rule and restore Charles VII to his rightful throne. If a 13-year-old of today had a vision from saints and went to the ruling powers and said, "I think you should be the true King of France," it probably wouldn't fly. But medieval France was a very different time, and it wasn't unusual for people to have visions of saints. It was not uncommon for all of the adults to be fully on board and support these divine missions. She had a mission from God to restore Charles VII to the throne. Her next move was to tell Charles himself. The first hurdle was to get there, and for that, she needed to be dressed a little more comfortably. The journey was more than 500 kilometers long, so for both comfort and practicality, she wore men's clothing. Remember the fact that she was dressed like a man, because later on at her trial, she wasn't convicted for faking her visions. She was convicted for heresy, which included dressing in men's clothing. Once she arrived at the court where Charles was, there was a story that he put on a disguise and sent another fellow to pretend to be Charles. But Joan was not fooled, and she pointed out who the real Charles was. The next test was a test of her purity. You see, Joan called herself Joan the Maid because that symbolized that she was pure and lived completely to fulfill the mission set for her by God. But in order for Charles to accept her as his prophet, she needed to prove her purity. These examinations were conducted by Charles's mother-in-law. She was subjected to another of these invasive tests when she was captured by the English and put on trial. With her purity test out of the way, it was time to get some armor, get her a horse, and get her down to the front lines to encourage the troops. For 5 weeks, she inspired the troops and is credited as leading them to many victories. One of the places that they captured back from the English was a place called Reims. This is where in 1429, Charles VII was crowned the King of France, and standing beside him at his coronation was Joan of Arc. From here, things went a little downhill for Joan. She was now 18 years old, and unfortunately, she was captured by the English and put on trial for heresy by the Catholic Church. The word heresy means that someone's actions seriously undermine the principles of the religion. She was grilled in an incredibly unfair trial. Today, we can still access these primary source documents of the court proceedings. The reason I say it was an unfair trial is that Joan was most probably illiterate, and she was put in a courtroom and interrogated about her visions and heresy by a bunch of old male monks who had studied theology and the Bible for their entire lives. She had no defense lawyer. She had to defend herself, often in front of an audience of 20 to 30 scholarly men. Reading through the court transcripts, it is glaringly obvious that they are trying to trick her into making an error in her recollections. All the while, she is being held in a prison cell chained to a wooden block. In fact, for the final few trial sessions, they didn't even bother with a courtroom. They just conducted the proceedings in her prison cell. Joan was then convicted of heresy, but the charges weren't about the validity of her visions. They were about the fact that she chose to wear men's clothing. She was burned at the stake, and because they didn't want anyone to worship her as a martyr, they burned her remains 3 times, so there was no evidence left. But that's not the end of her story. Her family never gave up on her, and 20 years later, at the request of her mother and brothers, she was given a second trial. Due to the corrupt and unfair nature of the first trial, the original verdict was overturned and Joan was exonerated. But obviously, you can't bring her back from being thrice burnt. Still, this is not the end of the story. The year was 1920, and France had just emerged after a very harrowing and destructive war, World War I. One way to lift the spirits of the French people, whose land had been decimated, was to make one of their very own historical figures a saint. This is when Joan of Arc became Saint Joan, the patron saint of soldiers of France. Don't forget to hit subscribe, and if you would like to hear an original song on this topic, there is a link to Go Down Fighting up there. And in the description below, you'll find a link to my website where you will find a list of references and some teaching resources. This is Kelly Chase, on the case. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this video is being recorded today. I pay my respects to the elders and knowledge holders, past, present, and emerging.